On behalf of our DASICON team, I have the honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's panel on equality around the world. So just to give you a quick overview and so have key informations, when we continue to on social and development indicators being drastically over-depressed among the extreme poor, multiple commitments of global leaders contrast with the daily realities of many women worldwide. So now the central question is, for our world, is how to step up and unlock the potential on half of this population. My name is Mareike WIEDERHOLD, and in collaboration with my colleague Melanie PETROV, I'm really pleased to be able to guide you through this event today. Thank you so much.
I also wish you a very warm welcome to today's panel. Before we get started, I will give you a short overview of what you can expect from the next 15 minutes. First, we will listen to our three distinguished speakers, starting with the keynote speech held by Dr. Heinz FISCHER. Then we will move on to two presentations from Ambassador Dr. Désirée SCHWEITZER and Ambassador Dr. Brigitta BLAHA. We will conclude with a Q&A session. There you will be able to take the floor and pose a question directly. Please use the chat function to indicate that. And if you do not feel comfortable doing that and asking in person, you may also send us the question via the chat. And we will collect all of your input and do our best to address as many inquiries as possible. So let's get going, I would say. It is an honor to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Heinz FISCHER. Dr. FISCHER was the president of the Republic of Austria between 2004 and 2016. Since leaving the office in 2016, he has been co-heading the Ban Ki-moon Center in Vienna, together with the former UN Secretary General, Dr. Ban Ki-moon. Thank you for being here and welcome. Dear Dr. FISCHER, may I now ask you to proceed and thereby officially start our panel?
With pleasure, thank you very much. The title of my presentation is The Political and Constitutional Development of Equal Rights for Women. And I was told it should be about 20 minutes. I will try my best. So I start by saying that the fight against discrimination of women, or the other way around, the fight for equal rights between men and women, is a key problem in our society and an important element of modern constitutions and human rights documents. Facts and figures show us that on the legal basis, we made significant progress in the last 100 and particularly in the last 25 years. But in praxis and on a global level, we are still quite far away from our goal of achieving full gender equality. In particular, the difference between theory and praxis in this regard is still significant. Why is this the case? What have we reached already? And what must be improved? Let me make some remarks to these questions. Humanity has lived a long history before the idea of human rights or the idea of equal chances for all human beings was developed, and before the first constitution was written. The reality of daily life was based on division of labor between men and women under the conditions of the daily fight for survival. The world of men was said to be fighting and hunting and protecting, etc. The world of women, on the other hand, was childcare, household, etc. This is a division of labor based on different capacities in early societies and not on human rights or constitution. It had nevertheless a strong influence on hierarchies and on power structures in our society. And even when early ideas of human dignity and democracy have been developed, as for instance 2,500 years ago, for the first time in Greek culture in Athens of Pericles, the idea of democracy did not form the structure of society, but other way around, the structure of society formed the idea of democracy. This means that democracy in Athens, being established on the basis of existing society, was giving equal political rights only for the male upper class, but did not change the very structure of Greek society itself, including the division between free citizens and slaves and the distinction between men with political rights and women without political rights. Not to speak about the difference between rich and poor. This hierarchical structure of society was not seen as discrimination of slaves or women, but was merely understood as a natural order and natural situation. This fundamental problem persists until today, namely the interaction between society and law and vice versa. Law, written or unwritten, is on the one side, as I mentioned already, influenced and created by the structure of society. On the other hand, law is ruling and guiding our society. But if our society is developing and changing over time, then law must react to these developments, and a new synthesis between law and society must be negotiated. Look, for instance, at the development of criminal law or family law or social policy legislation in the last 50 years in Europe. How much has been changed? We don't have enough time today to describe and analyze the development of law, constitution, and human rights over the centuries. But to make a big jump, in the 18th century, in the era of enlightenment in Europe and North America, time and society became more and more ready for human rights on the basis of rights for all human beings, regardless of sex, race, religion, etc. But very often, those who have privileges do not give way for peaceful changes and reforms. And therefore, several revolutions were necessary to change the structure, to change the constitution, and to bring new ideas into the legal system. The two most important documents in this field at that time were the Constitution of the United States of America from 1787 and the French Declaration of Human Rights from August 1789, stating that all human beings from the moment of birth are and remain free and equal in their rights, in theory. Dear friends, a frequent phenomenon is that history does not develop straightforward, but moves like a pendulum from the one side to the other side and back again, so that revolutionary movements, after having reached a peak, are followed by a backlash, a counter-revolution. This happened after the French Revolution, as we know, and it happened in other parts of Europe in the first half of the 19th century, when reactionary forces, the so-called Holy Alliance, namely the monarchies of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were dominating. It was again a revolution, namely Revolution of 1848, that brought about constitutional and political progress in several European countries. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the revolution of 48, was suppressed by the army, but the ideas of that revolution survived and reached some of their goals in a Declaration of Basic Rights in December 1867, establishing the principle that all citizens have equal rights, have to be treated equally by law, and establishing many other basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of science, etc., etc. And still, women had no right to vote. Nevertheless, remember the so-called democracy in Athens, as I just said, there was no right for women to vote or to be elected, no access for women to universities, no equal rights for women in the family, etc., etc. Political power, therefore, remained concentrated in the hands of men and of a few powerful men. It was a fight between the gravity of tradition and the needs of a modern society. And let us quick look at the further development. In some European countries, for instance in Finland, women got the right to vote already at the very beginning of the 20th century. But in many other countries, it lasted until the end of World War I, 1918, 1919. And there was another revolution necessary to create the modern state until substantial progress in this field was reached. In Austria and Germany, it was exactly the year 1918 when the right to vote and to be elected for women was established, and the first elections took place a few months later in February 1919. In France, it happened in 1936, and in Italy and several southern and southeastern European countries, this right was only established after World War II. The last European country in this respect, to my knowledge, was Liechtenstein in the year 1984. And you know that in the Arab world, for instance, it took much, much, much longer. The different countries started to move their legislation in the direction of more rights for women. And saying this, I'm speaking about legislation and not about daily reality. In Austria, where I know the situation best, of course, in 1919, after women got the right to vote and to be elected, only 7 out of 165 members of parliament were women, meaning only a little bit more than 4%. And in the whole period in Austria between World War I and World War II, and similarly in Germany, we never had more than 10% women in parliament, and never had a female prime minister, and never had female members in a federal government, never female governors, never female speakers in the National Assembly, or female ambassadors, etc., etc. During World War II, millions of men had to serve in the army, and millions of women had to replace them in their jobs. As a consequence, the position of women became much stronger on the basis of this reality, not so much on the basis of legislation. Of course, I do not say that we need a catastrophe like a war to make progress in the field of gender equality. But what I want to say is that changes in the structure of society are paving the way towards progress in our legislation, and vice versa. Reforms in our legislation can help to pave the way towards a peaceful development in our society. It is possible that legislation is ahead of societal reality, as it was the case in the course of the French Revolution. And it is possible that legislation is behind societal development, as it was the case in many European countries after World War II. This means that a peaceful way for reforms in our society needs an interaction between practical progress in daily life and adequate changes in the field of legislation. Let me make a personal remark. When I married in 1968, the Austrian family law literally said, since the year 1811, that the man is the head of the family and the woman has to obey his orders, in German seinen Anordnungen, and make children and employers obey these orders as well. And the married woman needed the approval of her husband to apply for a passport and many other personal decisions. Lots of reforms in family law, civil law, criminal law, labor legislation, etc. were necessary in the 70s of the last century to make the gap between societal reality and legislation smaller. And this was the case in many European countries. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now have a wider look at the constitutional and political development after World War II. A real milestone was the Human Rights Declaration adopted by the United Nations in December 1948. Article 1 in this declaration is, in my opinion, a great statement. It reads, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." I like this paragraph so much that when I was president of parliament in Austria, I ordered that this text is inscripted in stone near the entrance to our parliament, because this is such a fundamental declaration. The Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations was followed by the European Convention of the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms in November 1950, which also puts great emphasis on the equality between men and women. Germany joined this declaration in 1952, Austria in 1958. But the main problem was still not the legislation, nor the text of declarations, but their implementation. In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women, convened by the United Nations, was hosted in Beijing. More than 6,000 representatives from 189 countries participated. And I followed very closely the negotiations at this conference from Vienna. The adopted Charter of Beijing obligated all participating countries to work for gender equality in all spheres of life and fight against any form of discrimination. A United Nations resolution followed in 2000, and the year 2020 marked the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. However, inequalities and different forms of discrimination still exist around the world. That's the reason for your conference. It must also be said that the issue of gender equality must not be seen, discussed, and tackled as an isolated phenomenon. It is closely connected to other basic problems of our society, like poverty, access to education, the SDGs adopted in 1915, must be addressed when talking about gender equality. Gender equality is not only goal number 5 in the SDGs, but it is closely linked with other basic values and basic goals in a future society, in a world where the Human Rights Declaration as a whole has come nearer to reality as it is today. And this is the great value of the SDGs, that they are not targeting only on one problem, but connecting the most urgent problems in our time. The concluding remarks state, where are we standing today? The World Policy Analysis Center of the University of California published a study about equal rights of women in the field of policy, education, health, work, etc. And the concluding remarks say the following, I quote, "On a global scale, countries have made important strides in advancing gender equality in critical areas of concern of the Beijing platform since 1995. Overall protection of the rights to equality for women in general and in the areas of education, health, employment, political decision-making, and family life in particular are more frequently included in constitutions that were adopted since Beijing. This suggests that the increased international recognition of the importance of gender equality over the last few decades may bring encouraging change However, protections are weaker when we examine specific rights with these spheres as is summarized below. This is the quotation from this document. And every year, the European Institute for Gender Equality publishes a Gender Equality Index to analyze how much progress was made in the previous year. And the conclusions for 2020 reads as following, I quote, "The European Union's progress on gender equality is still slow, with the index score improving on average only 1 point every 2 years. At this rate, it would take over 60 years to reach full gender equality in theory and praxis. The biggest improvement has been in decision-making, which has been driving most of the change in the Gender Equality Index. Since 2010, the domain of power has contributed 2/3 of the overall gain in gender equality in the European Union. This shows us that change is possible when legislative measures and other proactive government actions are implemented." End of quotation. In other words, progress in the field of political rights and the possibility for women to reach top positions in policy has developed faster than gender equality in other fields, as for instance, equal pay for equal work. On February 21st, only a few days ago, was Equal Pay Day for 2021, and still women earn 40% less than men on a comparable basis. My conclusions and deliberations, therefore, are the following. In the last century and in the last decades, mankind has made significant progress in the area of equal rights and chances for men and women. But a significant gap still exists, and it cannot be closed only by additional legislation. To close it, additional changes in the structure for our society, in the division of labor, and in our thinking are necessary. Only if the contribution of women to our GDP is counted in the same way as the contribution of men, and only if the working conditions are such that women can equally contribute to our GDP, and only if the idea of gender equality is deeply rooted in every area of our thinking, then we will reach satisfactory results. I'm not sure whether the generation of men and women sitting in the virtual room of our meeting will see the final results of this development. But I'm quite sure that the next generations will see gender equality and human rights manifest and unfold on every level necessary to solve the problems of the 21st century. And the fight for gender equality behind us will be a part of our history, like the fight against slavery or the fight to eliminate the differences between aristocracy and ordinary people. That's my opinion, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fischer, for your important and valuable input you gave us, as well as the insights you gave us on the developments and the milestones that have been reached in the past and up until today. Thank you again. And next, it is a pleasure for me to present you Ambassador Dr. Désirée Schweitzer. Dr. Schweitzer assumed the position of Director General of the Development Section at the Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs in March 2018. And she's also the President of the Austrian UN Women National Committee. Thank you very much for being here and welcome, Dr. Schweitzer. Please, you may have the floor now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to share this virtual stage with my distinguished fellow panelists and President Fischer, of course, and to speak with you today. The last year should have been a celebratory one for accelerating gender equality globally. It marked, and President Fischer already touched upon some of the highlights, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the groundbreaking UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, 10 years of UN Women, and of course, 5 years of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 that should lead all our activities. Instead of celebrating the gains, we saw the progress made over recent decades dramatically reversed. On the one hand, by changing political environment and of course, by COVID-19. We witnessed the rise in inequalities, in poverty, gender-based violence, and women and girls were the first to be impacted by what UN Women calls the shadow pandemic. Therefore, now it is more important than ever to stand firmly for gender equality and to push forward. So thank you again for organizing this timely conference. First slide, I think this is not the first slide, but yes, thank you very much. Austria has been a strong supporter of gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment in its foreign policy and also its development cooperation. And this thematic focus is also highlighted in the government program and the current 3-year program on Austrian development policy. And in the next few minutes, I would like to give you some insight on what the Austrian Development Cooperation does to support the advancement of gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment, an important prerequisite for poverty reduction, social development, and economic growth. I would like to begin with looking at the challenge of financing gender equality, then touch upon the importance of relevant data before concluding with some concrete project examples. Next slide, please. As you know, gender equality is a fundamental human right and part of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. The goals are all connected, and we cannot only look at goal 5 to achieve gender equality, but you have to look at all of them together. Unfortunately, though, not one single country in the world, including in Europe, is on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, as suggested by the Agenda 2030. SDG 5 on gender equality is one of the 3 least financed SDGs globally. So next slide, please. Could I ask? Yeah, thank you very much. That is why the EU committed in the EU Gender Action Plan to dedicate at least 85% of all new external actions to gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. This share has steadily increased from 58% in 2016, as you can see, when the target was first introduced, to 65% in 2019. The EU is now determined to reach the 85% target by 2025. And on the slide, you see Austria's commitment. We continuously work on increasing the share of projects that promote gender equality and women's empowerment. We were able to increase our share from 72% in 2016 to 80% in 2019. So you see, we're not there yet, but we are working hard to reach our targets. Next slide, please. Another challenge we face in realizing our commitments to SDG 5 is the lack of quality data. We need to collect reliable and comprehensive data, disaggregated by sex as well as gender data. This is essential to identify gaps, to design impactful policies, and to track progress. Therefore, Austria has supported the OECD in establishing a social institutions and gender index. With this index, the OECD measures discrimination against women in social institutions across 180 countries. By looking at laws, social norms, and practices, the index captures the underlying drivers of gender inequality. For example, child, early, and forced marriage might be illegal in a country, but still practiced because the underlying social norms and beliefs of the population have not changed. By providing this data to decision makers, they have the information they need to take targeted action. So the index is an important resource for anyone interested in understanding the underlying causes of gender inequality. I hope I didn't get too technical up until now. I promise the next few minutes will be more hands-on. So the main focus of the ADC regarding gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment are the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the fight against sexual and gender-based violence and against female genital mutilation, the economic and political empowerment of women and girls, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think it might be interesting to briefly illustrate our work in these areas with 3 concrete examples. These examples will take us from a project to reduce FGM in Ethiopia to the north of Uganda, where we support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And our last example will take us back to Vienna, to the Global Women's Forum for Peace and Humanitarian Action that took place last year in February in Vienna. Next slide, please. Ethiopia is a partner country of the Austrian Development Corporation. That's the correct slide, thank you. And even though FGM is legally prohibited in the country, around 65% of Ethiopian women and girls are affected by it. If we look at figures worldwide, evidence suggests that FGM is practiced in 92 countries and around 200 million women and girls have been subjected to it. Austria is engaged in Ethiopia in several projects and programs in this field. For example, since 2008, we support the Austrian NGO Horizont 3000 in a project that aims at raising awareness in local communities and providing health support in view of the medical consequences associated with FGM. One concrete result I wanted to mention is that the women who benefited from this project are now advocating themselves in their communities to put an end to FGM. Next slide, please. From Ethiopia now we go to Uganda, another partner country of the ADC. In the north of Uganda, we support a program run by Care Austria. Its goal is to increase the resilience of women and youth by empowering them economically, to decrease the risk of sexual and gender-based violence. The CARE program is situated in a post-conflict setting that has experienced a massive influx of refugees, over 80% of them women and children under the age of 18. In this area, the local population is growing by 3% every year. As economic opportunities are scarce, many are therefore forced to move to urban areas, and we know that in urban areas, the risk of prostitution, trafficking in women, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence increase. Therefore, within the scope of this program, women receive vocational training, join local savings groups, and get the support they need to launch their own businesses. They also receive psychosocial support and are empowered to take an active role themselves to raise awareness about sexual and gender-based violence. Finally, let me turn to something completely different, because successfully impacting women's equality doesn't just require action on the ground. It also needs collaboration and the sharing of ideas. Austria had the pleasure of co-hosting the Global Women's Forum for Peace and Humanitarian Action last year in February to foster synergies among the 70 grassroots women peace builders and humanitarian responders from 17 countries that you see on the slides now. During the forum, the participants formulated an outcome document, the Vienna Declaration, with concrete policy recommendations and calls to action to ensure the effective implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. We co-hosted this event together with the Global Network of Women Peace Builders and the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. These two organizations work closely together with grassroots and local women's rights organizations. And that was essential of connecting the representatives in this event. We will make sure to include the important contribution and what we learned from this conference in our future work. Hope I was able to paint a picture of the work of the ADC in advancing gender equality with these examples. Of course, there are many more. And if you're interested in further details, so please check out the website or contact me after this conference. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm also the president of UN Women Austria. So gender equality and empowerment of women is not only part of my job description, but also a personal cause close to my heart. UN Women Austria is an NGO that is connected to UN Women headquarters and supports the UN Women agenda. We focus on awareness raising and fundraising, and one example for awareness raising that I wanted to mention is the implementation of the Orange the World campaign that is UN Women launches the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence every year between the 25th of November, that is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and the 10th of December, International Human Rights Day. Worldwide, buildings are lit up in orange to send a message against gender-based violence. And Austria participated for the first time in this campaign in 2017. And we managed to get a few excellent partners on board, among them the Ban Ki-moon Center, the He for She and Soroptimist International. And the campaign was very successful, I may say, last year. And we reached to all corners of Austria, thanks to the partnership with the organizations I mentioned. And together over 200 buildings were illuminated in orange. We also engage in fundraising. Our fundraising activities focus on the UN Women projects in Jordan, in the camps of Zaatari and Azraq, where UN Women provides oases, safe spaces for women in the camps where they can engage in cash for work programs and get capacity building and have some positive outlook for a self-determined life after they will be able to leave the camps and return to their country. So I want to conclude now and leave you with one thought. Gender equality is about leveling the playing field, and that is why we need everyone on board, because only with the participation of everybody we can achieve gender equality and equality for all. So thank you very much for organizing this conference, and I see that you have thought about all the topics that are connected to advancing gender equality. You also have panels on including men, on changing the perceptions of masculinity, all very important topics also during the discussions of the upcoming CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. Thank you very much again. I look forward to your questions.
So first of all, thank you so much, Ambassador Dr. Schweitzer, for your really interesting input. So may I now have the opportunity to introduce our aspiring speaker, Ambassador Dr. Brigitta BLAHA. Dr. BLAHA is an Austrian diplomat, and most recently she was ambassador in Islamabad and was responsible for Pakistan and Afghanistan as well. She has worked on women issues on related projects in various fields, and she is now serving on the board of the Alumni Association of the Diplomatic Academy, and is also president of the Austrian Pakistan Society. Thank you very much for being here, and welcome, Dr. BLAHA. The stage is yours now.
Well, thank you very much, Mareike, for the introduction. I'm happy to be here and also very honored to be on the same panel as our former president, Heinz FISCHER, and my dear colleague, Désirée Schweitzer. President FISCHER has painted the wider picture of equal rights, human rights, the historic dimension, the legal basis. Ambassador Schweitzer has talked about the activities of the Austrian Development Corporation. I would like to focus on my experience in the Foreign Service, on the one hand in Japan and in China, two countries whose cultural backgrounds historically is based on Confucianism, and on the other hand on Pakistan, a country based on Islam, as the official name already indicates, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, sorry. We are talking about gender equality. What do we mean by that? I would define it as equal ease of access to resources and opportunities, regardless of gender. UNICEF says gender equality, and I quote, means that women and men and girls and boys enjoy the same rights, resources, opportunities, and protections. It does not require that girls and boys or women and men be the same or that they be treated exactly alike. Gender is relative to context. Geography, religion, and family attitudes are such contextual factors. So how is the situation in Japan? Although Japan remains a socially conservative society with relatively pronounced gender roles, strong stereotypes that one gets from the media or the travel guides paint quite a different picture from the reality, which portray women in Japan as submissive and lacking self-determination. Japanese women are mostly seen as housewives who do not participate in public life. In reality, most women are employed. The employment rate of women between the age of 15 and 64 is almost 70%, according to data from OECD, higher than, for instance, the United States female working population. However, Japan has a strong tradition of women being housewives and mothers after marriage. When they work, they often work part-time in order to accommodate their children's or husband's schedules, since taking care of the family and household continues to be seen as a predominantly female duty, and working women are expected to fulfill it. Corporate culture also plays a role. Many men are expected to socialize after work, sometimes after long working hours, something which is difficult to combine with traditional female domestic roles. The traditional role of women in Japan has been defined as the 3 submissions. Young women submit to their fathers, married women submit to their husbands, and elderly women submit to their sons. Actually, a similar system also applies in Pakistan, and I have had many situations where I had to fill in forms and always needed to mention my father's or my husband's name. And I used my father's name and wondered what he would think that 20 years after he died, his name showed up on many forms in Pakistan. What I hear from Japanese girlfriends is that there is a considerable difference between the generations. The older generation still sticks to and accepts traditional values. The middle generation has been struggling with it. And for the younger generation, it's now becoming more of a reality. Let us look now at China. The lives of women in China have changed significantly over the centuries. For Confucianism, the ideal role for a woman was to take care of a large household. Women typically didn't have formal roles in Confucian life outside the home. China's constitution guarantees women, I quote, equal rights with men in all spheres of life. Achievement of women's liberation has been on the agenda of the Communist Party since the beginning of the PRC. Mao Zedong famously said, "Women hold up half the sky." In 1995, it was already mentioned that the 4th UN World Conference on Women took place in Beijing that same year. The Chinese Communist Party Secretary General Jiang Zemin declared gender equality an official state policy. Over the last several decades, women in China have enjoyed some considerable gains. Life expectancy and literacy rates have risen as China's economy has developed. Although China has been very successful in achieving greater gender parity, women still suffer a lower status compared with men. Now, China has a problem of an aging population. With a need to push for higher birth rates to combat this problem, the Chinese leadership started to change its once progressive ideas of promoting gender equality in order to increase the labor force participation rate. Instead, the authorities have started to promote more conservative values, such as family unity and traditional values, encouraging women to get married and raise children. And despite facing criticism and opposition, has not hesitated to adopt changes in the interest of the fight against low birth rates, even at the expense of personal freedom and equalities. Traditionally, women in Hong Kong, and this was actually my posting, they have been situated within the context of Chinese family and society, in which they were treated the same as mainland women or Taiwanese women. However, there are cultural differences between mainland Chinese and citizens of Hong Kong. During the British colonial period, the emergence of Western culture created a mix of traditional Chinese and Western values. This created a unique situation for Hong Kong, along with the rapid economic and social development. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been a significant improvement in the social status of women. However, the male dominant structure still persists in some aspects of women's life. During the past 3 decades, women in Hong Kong have become more financially independent, assertive, and career-focused. This may make them more prominent compared with women in other East Asian countries. The number of women in professional and managerial positions increased in recent decades, especially also since the enactment of anti-discrimination laws in the mid-1990s and the establishment of the Women's Commission in 2001 as a central mechanism to promote the well-being and interests of women. It has advocated gender mainstreaming as a key strategy in achieving gender equality. Now, the last country I would like to talk about is women in Pakistan. They make up almost half of the population, according to the latest census in 2017. Women in Pakistan have played an important role throughout Pakistan's history, starting with the Pakistan movement, as Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, said to a women's gathering in 1947, "Half of Pakistan is yours because you have put in no less effort to achieve it than the men." They also got the right to vote in the same year. In Pakistan, women have held high offices, including that of the Prime Minister. You will all remember Benazir Bhutto, Speaker of the National Assembly, leader of the opposition, as well as federal ministers, judges, and commission posts in the armed forces. The status of women differs considerably across classes, regions, and the rural-urban divide due to the uneven socio-economic development and the influence of tribal and feudal powers. Many women in Pakistan still face social, religious, and economic and political obstacles which prevent them from exercising their political rights, and they face discrimination as the result of a patriarchal society. Some of the problems are forced marriages, domestic violence, honor killings, rape, and induced abortions. Religious groups and civil society are increasingly denouncing this violence against women, and courts have answered the call by women's rights advocates throughout the country and delivered harsher punishments for violent crimes against women. Key to improving the situation is education. However, while the government of Pakistan has legislated education for all, education remains drastically underfunded. The problems of girls' education has been pointed out by various NGOs, action groups, and notably by Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban in 2012 for attempting to attend school and received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. Gender Concerns International, a Dutch-based NGO, reports that the overall women's rights in Pakistan has improved with more women being educated and literate. However, the Global Gender Gap Index report of 2020 ranked Pakistan 151 out of 153 countries. And the World Economic Report 2018 ranked Pakistan at 148 out of 149 countries for women empowerment. So you see, there is a lot to do. In the short time, I could only focus on a few aspects of the state of equality. One thing is certain: equality applies to all. It's a work in progress. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ambassador BLAHA. We're really grateful for your interesting, insightful insights. And we will now open the floor for Q&A sessions, but we're still limited on time. So we try to have 1 or 2 questions, maybe one, because we're really running out of time. I'm really sorry for that. And yeah, now, Melanie, I'll take off to you.
So we have one question from Vanessa Casares Lukin, if I pronounced it correctly. Please, Vanessa, you may have the floor. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I have a quick general question. How could gender equality be achieved in countries where culture is still favoring men over women, despite established laws on the matter, and where education is sometimes not granted to everyone? Thank you.
My theory or my experience is that progress in many fields of society, including gender equality, is a result of a combination or cooperation between change in the society on the basis of technology and industry and education and health and medicine, etc. These factors of the structure of a society change something, and legislation plays a role. And you need a positive cooperation or coordination between the development of the society and the development of the legal basis. And if one of the two sides is blocked, if a dictatorship doesn't want to take care on the societal development, or if a catastrophe, a pandemic, a war is blocking the societal development, then you stay behind, then you have no progress, then you have no peaceful development. And if the difference between the structure of the society on the one side and the constitution and the legislation on the other side becomes too big, you have the danger or the possibility of a revolution and of a change without the approval of the legal system. This is how history develops, and we as human beings have every and each of us the possibility to influence these two spheres in a certain way, and if enough people are engaged, then you will reach progress. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fischer, for your input. Then we will address the question from Stefania Stregel. Stefania, you may have the floor.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ms. BLAHA. I mean, for all of the presentation, I would address my question to Brigitta BLAHA. To what extent has COVID-19 influenced the work of UN Women in the countries you elaborated on? Yeah, that would be my question. Thank you very much for your answer.
I think, again, this is not a question for me, but rather for Ambassador Schweitzer.
I'm here. I hear you and I heard the question. Yeah,
I'm happy to receive any answer. Thank you very much.
UN Women, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, has realized that the COVID-19 pandemic brought a big pushback for what we achieved in gender equality. and also, of course, an increase in domestic violence, in all forms of gender-based violence. And that's why the pandemic, UN Women coined this phrase of the shadow pandemic, because this pushback we see here now will take a very long time to be able to catch up with and achieve the status we had before. And as I heard someone say, there's no vaccination against gender inequality. There's no vaccination against all the forms of gender-based violence. But we need to, as a society, and each and every person, I think, needs to stand up and speak when you see inequality happen, when you see situations that you think should be addressed. You have to support women who are not in the situation to have by the speak up again, to be able to speak up against injustice. You have to know your own privilege, and from this position support those who are not as free in expressing what they would like to do to move the gender equality ahead. And I think UN Women is designing respective programs. UN Women is working with its regional office all over the world, and there are also 11 national committees who, with all modesty, try to support these causes. Thank you. But of course, I can add one concrete example. There are estimates by the United Nations Population Fund that because of COVID-19, 2 million additional women and girls mostly will be affected by FGM until 2030. That's a shocking number, and why, you may ask, do we know that, or are the estimates going in this direction? It's because because of COVID-19, a lot of programs addressing FGM were diverted into other fields.
On behalf of our whole DASICON team, I really would like to express my appreciation to our distinguished speakers, also to our participants and the whole team in all. A last word to Melanie recording our organization. We will finish for now, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Before we leave, we would like to point out to those of you who are moving on to the breakout sessions on Path to Economic Independence and Cultural Perspective on Feminism. These are going to be recorded as well, and these actually start at 12. We're sorry for taking a bit longer. I would also like to express my gratitude to our speakers, to our team, and to all the participants for their questions. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.